Hello, Amy Smith here from Brubakers, and this is the 1467 that we're going to review today. And for those of you who own a 1371, the operations and everything on that machine are identical. The only difference is the program panel over here has square buttons instead of oval buttons. So for this video is for the 1371 and 1467 owners. 1467 was created as the third in line in the Creative series, which are the top of the line Pfaff machines. The thing about Pfaff that makes them particularly special, or it made them when they were making them in Germany, is that they put the same amount of quality, parts, everything in all of their machines. So as you go up in price, you go up in features and stitches, but you don't go up in terms of a quality gain. The machines are top quality from the bottom up. Before I start going through the functions of the machine, I would like to talk about oiling, because this is something that everybody forgets to do. The book is very vague. It says something to the effect of, you should oil your machine every once in a while. But every once in a while can mean a lot of different things to different people. So what I do is I put one small drop of oil in my machine every time I sit down to use it. And this is the case for any German Pfaff. Where to oil it? I just put the oil drop right here along this ridge. Just put a drop of oil, and then I run the machine, put this piece of scrap fabric in and run the machine for about 1 to 2 minutes to work that oil through. Don't forget to close this door, because this door has a lens on it, which is part of your bobbin monitor system. And if the door is open, it won't read that your bobbin is getting low. And that's a nice feature to have. So why leave the door open? Okay, the other thing about threading, always thread with your presser foot up in the highest position, which releases your tension discs and allows your thread to get seated completely into the tension. If your foot is down when you thread, your tensions are closed, and your thread is just going to ride right on top of those discs, and you're not going to get any tension, and you're going to get a real big bird's nest on the back. So make sure your presser foot is raised, and if you're not sure after you have it threaded, pull your thread with your foot up, lower the foot, pull the thread again, and it should get so tight that you can actually move the needle. So that's how you check, I call it the tension test. All right, so now let's go to our function buttons. The first button here is our needle down button, and when the light is on, the needle is always going to stop in the down position. So if the light is off, the needle will always stop up, but when I push this button to turn the needle down button, engage that, it will always stop down. It'll cycle down to the needle down position every time. Really handy feature when you're doing applique, when you're top stitching, when you're quilting and moving your fabric around. It's just a really nice feature to have. Tough to live without once you've got it. If you push the button again, your needle will raise automatically, which is really nice. You don't have to go hanging onto your hand wheel. The next button is your half speed button. Again, a great feature for somebody that's learning to sew, somebody that's just learning to free motion quilt. Here we are at full speed, and here we are at half speed. I call this my learning button. We use this when we're learning, but after you're comfortable with the machine, you can get the same amount of control with your foot control. But until then, it's a nice button to have. It's a nice button to use. The next button is your buttonhole key, and I'm not going to go into buttonholes today because my plan is to make a buttonhole video very soon. But as with all Pfaffs, every key, most keys have more than one function. So while this is a buttonhole key, it's also a single pattern key. So when you're sewing and you want to stop at the end of a pattern, you will push this button Let's leave it off. We'll push the button, and when you want to stop at the end of that pattern, you push the button. It'll complete the pattern, tie off, and stop for you. Really nice feature when you're doing scallops and you want to get to the end of a pattern and pivot and do a corner. If you're doing a name and you want it to stop at the end of your name, a lot of great applications for this feature. And the last feature is your reverse button. You have 2 reverses with this button. As you're sewing along, if you push the reverse button, it'll go in reverse, and when you leave it, take your finger off, it'll go forward again. But when you stop and push the reverse button so that the light is on, you have a constant reverse. And it won't go forward until you turn that light off again. So those are the button and the functions over our needle. Now let's talk about our program panel over here. That's my opal that you hear squeaking because she's dying to play. Okay, we'll play in a minute. We'll play in a minute. We'll play in a minute. Okay, okay, over there. The first 2 buttons are your program buttons. These are the buttons that you're using to select your stitch. When you turn the machine on, it automatically defaults to a straight stitch, but you have 2 sets of buttons, plus and minus on both. That's up and down, where you can go up and down numerically. The first button on the left is your 10 button, and the second button is your 1 button. So if I wanted to go to a zigzag, zigzag happens to be stitch number 10. All I have to do is push plus 1 time, and I've got my zigzag. The nice thing about an electronic machine is when you select a stitch, the small circuit board in the machine selects the optimum width and length that it thinks you should have. For the most part, you're going to leave that when you're working with your decorative stitches. But with a zigzag or a straight stitch, you're going to play with your length and your width quite a bit. So the next 2 buttons are your length and width button. The first one is your width, and the light is showing because you're on a zigzag. So you can go down to make it narrower, or you can go up, all the way up to 6 millimeters to make it wider, or anywhere in between. And I don't know if you can see this, but there's your zigzag. Narrow, narrower, and the widest you can get. But it is variable everywhere in between. So that's your stitch width. If you want to go to your stitch length, if you want to make your stitch length longer, you can hold your finger down and raise it. It'll open the stitch up for you. Or if you want to make it closer together, which would be like a satin stitch, you're going to bring your stitch length down towards the 0. And I don't want to go too close because I don't have the correct presser foot on the machine. But that's going to give you your satin stitch. Biggest problem people have is the relationship between your stitch width and your stitch length, so play with that. Okay, this button here is your mirror image button. So if you have a scallop, it'll flip it the other way, left or right. And this last button is your pattern start button, which means that if you're in the middle of your sewing and you're doing a decorative stitch and you stop and you want to start over, you can push this button and it'll start back at the beginning of the pattern. Think of that as your start over button, okay? And that's basically it. Now these 2 buttons up here are your programming buttons, and these buttons can be used to program in stitch sequences. So what we're going to do is program in a few letters so that you can see how that's done. The first thing we're going to do is find our memory function over here, and I happen to know that the fastest way to get there is to go minus 2 times from the stitch number 10 down to memory. Then we're going to push Mem plus, and we're going to find our alphabet. So I'm going to go back up, back down to A, And we're going to put in A, B, C, M so I can show you how to get to your stitches. So we're going to push A, plus, and then in your ones button, you're going to push B, push plus one time to get to B, plus, one more time to get to C, plus, and then let's go on down to M, plus. And I've put in A, B, C, M. So we'll stitch that out. And while I start to stitch, I'm going to push that buttonhole button so that it stops at the end of my sequence. And there you have your A, B, C, and M. All right? And it stopped at the end of the sequence. And I just remembered I forgot a button. This button right here is your stitch balance button or your stitch elongator. Remember I said all the Pfaff buttons usually have more than one function. So let's go to a satin stitch, which would be, let's go to stitch number 41. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, and that's 41. This is my zigzag, and we will put our fabric under, and I'll just show you what that stitch looks like. I just happened to get lucky and stop at the end of the pattern. There's your satin stitch. Let's elongate that. So we're going to put our fabric back in, and we're going to push this button plus. Right now it's at 14 millimeters. I'm going to go all the way up to, you actually can go all the way up to 80 millimeters, but I'm going to come down and go to like 4.5. Actually, it's 8 millimeters, or 8 length. I'm not sure how they gauge that. And I'll push my single pattern button so it stops at the end. There we go. And you can see that it's elongated the stitch, but it has maintained the beautiful stitch length satin stitch. The other function for this is if you're on one of the stretch stitches, one of the reverse motion stitches, and it's not feeding back and forth quite as precisely as you'd like, you can tweak it up and down with this button, but you don't use that very often. You don't, usually only if you're working with a real tricky fabric. And that's it for the functions. I do want to go over bobbin winding real quick with you. When you wind your bobbin, you are going to disengage your clutch here. Put your bobbin on. There's a little pin here. You put your bobbin on and make sure it falls into that pin. You probably all already know that. But this is a common mistake that people make. Declutch your machine and wind your bobbin. When you go to sew again, you're going to move that inner hand wheel back a quarter turn. But before you start to sew, I would like you to turn the wheel forward till you hear a click. And if you do that, you're going to really extend the life of your machine. And I'll tell you why. Inside this hand wheel are 3 parts. There's a spring, a white, like a guide, and then the black clutch member. The clutch member fits into what they call a coupler that is pinned to the main shaft. So when you wind that bobbin and then you go back and you hear that click, what's happening is that clutch member has slid into the groove of the clutch coupler where it belongs. If you don't do that and you just start to sew, and especially if you start to sew really fast, that coupler is not going to may not find that hole, that groove that it belongs. And you could end up with this horrible sound that sounds like a machine gun. And the only way you can get it to stop is to turn the machine off and back on again. But even if that doesn't happen, what you're doing is wearing the edges of your clutch coupler. And if it wears too much, it'll have to be replaced. And worst case scenario, if you do that machine gun thing too many times, you're going to break the clutch coupler that's pinned to your main shaft. And those two parts are actually mated, so you'd have to replace the whole main shaft. So that could be a pretty costly repair if that happened. So I'd like you to just be mindful of that. We all forget once in a while, but try not to. And I think that about covers it. Don't forget to change your needle every time you go to a new project. And when you go to change your thread, going back over to this side, when you go to change your thread, please clip it up here and pull it out through the needle. And that's going to save you a hefty service bill too, because when you pull it out backwards, very often your thread's got a little knot, or at the very least it's got lint. And when you pull it backwards, you can get all kinds of things that end up settling in here. I call them goobers. And once you get a goober in there, you're not going to get a good quality stitch. It'll look very nice on the front, and you turn it around to the back and it's going to look like a bird's nest. Because once you get anything in there that's the thickness of a piece of thread, it's going to throw your tension off. So please be mindful of that. And as far as your bobbin tension goes, your bobbin tension should be factory set or set by your technician. You should be able to hold your thread and dangle your bobbin case without it dropping. But if you give it a little tug, little shake like this, it will drop. And that's good bobbin tension. If it does drop, the larger screw on your bobbin case is the one that you adjust. And if that slot on the screw were a large hand on the clock, move it 5 minutes at a time. And of course, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. What I would recommend is, if you like me, like to play with a lot of different threads, I would recommend that you invest in a factory OEM, original equipment manufacturer, bobbin case. And that way you can just put a little dab of nail polish in the inside, and that's your play bobbin case, and you can loosen, tighten to your heart's content. Don't waste your money on the bobbin cases that you see on eBay for $15 or $30, because they're not worth a penny. You'll never get a good bobbin tension with those bobbin cases, because the springs are, they're just not good. So that's it. If you have any questions, you're welcome to email me at sewing@ptd.net. And I look forward to doing more videos for you. Thank you for listening.